Welcome to The Voices of War, a podcast with a simple vision, to bring to life the true costs of war through the voices of those who've lived it. I'm Maz, and I speak to soldiers, academics, refugees, peacemakers, and anyone else who's been touched by war, in the hope of demystifying and, most importantly, de-glorifying it. If you like what you hear, please consider showing your support by reviewing the show wherever you get your pods. You can also support us on our Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee page. Links to both are in the show notes. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Hi everyone, this is Maz. Just a brief preamble to this episode with Special Forces veteran John Gartner. As you will hear, he has more than 50 years of experience serving in various Special Forces units, as well as a security advisor working in many conflict areas around the world. The man has seen just about every side of war that there is to see. Having said that, some of his views may be considered controversial, especially when discussing post-traumatic stress disorder. Those who regularly listen to the podcast will know that I welcome such edgy discussions, as I hope to shed light on some of the more taboo topics related to war. If you have a particularly strong opinion about anything mentioned in this episode, please feel free to share your thoughts by writing a public comment on your podcatcher or social media, making sure you tag The Voices of War. Alternatively, you can send me a private note on info@thevoicesofwar.com. Lastly, I want to give a big shout out and thanks to two recent Patreon supporters, both of whom have opted to donate beyond the suggested $5 per month. Thank you, Steve and Sarah. Your support means the world to me, and I'll keep working hard to bring you high quality content about a grossly misunderstood human endeavour that has far-reaching and significant implications. Okay, let's meet our next guest, John Gartner. My guest today is John Gartner, whose career as a professional soldier and security advisor spans more than 5 decades. During that time, he served in the Australian SAS, Rhodesian SAS, Selous Scouts, South African National Intelligence Service, and as a trainer for Sri Lankan Infantry and Special Forces units. He then had a slight change of pace and served for 6 years as a security and close protection advisor for the former Saudi Arabian oil minister, Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani. After this job, he relocated to Brunei, where he spent a further 3 years in a high-profile security advisory role for the Brunei Royal Family, working primarily for Prince Jeffrey Bolkiah and his son, Prince Abdul Hakim. In 1998, he returned to Australia to establish OAM Australia, and then in 1999, OAM Indonesia, based in Jakarta. Since then, he has delivered and continues to deliver strategic and tactical security consultancy services and risk management support throughout Africa, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and South America. He joins me today to discuss lessons learned throughout his career, which is also captured in incredible detail in his memoir titled The Fading Light. I just finished this book, which is a combination of unbelievable operational detail, as well as reflections of a man who's seen the best and the worst side of war. John, thank you very much for joining me on The Voices of War.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
So, John, before we get into the nitty-gritty details of your career, maybe let's go to where it all started. What motivated you to join the army in the first place?
You know, it's actually quite bland and dry. I was born in Adelaide, of course, and raised there, and this was in the 60s and 70s, and I came from a lower socio-economic background, so I didn't have much in the way of options growing up. I didn't go to university. I finished high school, went into sort of the commercial world for a few years, and but found it incredibly boring. Now, I had been quite a voracious reader in my mid-teens, and a lot of that was based on stories of warfare and combat and so forth. And of course, you know, in your teens, you actually see the idealistic side of these things. You don't actually see the horrors that go with that. But I just decided, well, to get out of my economic sort of lower life, the best course would be to spend a couple of years, 3 years actually, in the Australian Army, which would give me a financial platform and a little bit of experience. And then I would see whether I'd carry on with my time in Australia. I had no intention at that stage of going overseas. My career path would have been in the Australian Army. It was only as it evolved through that 3 years that I changed my mind about where I wanted to go, and then left the army. And I enlisted in '71, and did my 3-year service, which included the SAS selection and time in the SAS regiment here in Swanbourne. And then I decided to go overseas. So that was it. Nothing dramatic. No journey on the awakening on the road to Damascus sort of thing. It was just a slow progression as to where I wanted to go and what I wanted to do. By being in the Australian SAS at the end of the Vietnam War was probably the sort of motivator that I really didn't want to stay there, simply because as I said, as a teenager, you tend to have a very sort of compromised view of what war is really like. It's very naive. And I had it in my mind that if I'm going into the Australian Army, this was the height of the Vietnam conflict as well, that I would want to test myself in that environment as a soldier. By going across to the SAS, I thought it would be more challenging in that role in a combat environment. But as I was doing, or towards the time I was doing my selection, which was September 71, the Australian government withdrew 2 Squadron SAS regiment, which was the last squadron to serve there. They came back to Swanbourne, and that was it. They were disbanded, and the guys who were left in that unit were spread amongst 1 squadron and 3 squadron. So I got the endless stories about what a great time it was to have served in Vietnam, what a great experience it was. But at 19, 20, 21, with not a ribbon on my chest, it was a little bit sort of irksome at times listening. And of course, these guys would pull the piss somewhat, Oh, you haven't really done much. You haven't done much, John. Your time will come, but maybe when. So it was a little bit challenging serving in a unit where so many guys had combat experience and I didn't. And I wasn't alone. There was a large number of younger guys who came in 71, 72, 73 who experienced the same sense of sort of uncertainty about where they were going and what they were doing, and feeling a little bit sort of diminished in the fact that they hadn't served with their peers and their colleagues and comrades in a combat environment. Hence why when Rhodesia sort of popped up on the radar, and SAS, I knew SAS and Rhodesia was recruiting, and I knew that the war was getting underway. It wasn't intense at that stage in 74, but it was clearly going to become intense. And I sent my documentation over to Salisbury in Rhodesia, now Harare, of course, in Zimbabwe. And they offered me a position, a chance to do the selection, and that's why I went. So missed Vietnam, didn't want to serve a long time in Australian SAS doing a lot. And in those days, Australian SAS was a small unit, it was only 1 in 3 squadrons. It's much bigger now. And in those days as well, one of the 2 squadrons would be on training for a month. The other squadron would be on regimental duties. So every second month you were running around picking up rubbish bins, and so it's all subcontracted out now. But in those days, the boys had to do it, and being a trooper, I could be working one day in the OR's mess. The next day I could be up in the sergeant's mess washing pots and pans, and the next day I could be driving around a truck sort of picking up the garbage bin. So it wasn't sort of an environment in which I wanted to stay.
And of course, not the environment that the troopers are in right now. Yeah.
No, and that's right. And I remember having one day I was, even though 50 years later, this still bugs me. I was working in the officers' mess. I was actually washing in the kitchen, washing pots and pans. And one of the young officers who wasn't actually an SAS officer, he was from Karakata, came down for lunch apparently. Anyway, the cook said to me, "You need to take some butter out and put it on the table." So I took some butter out of the fridge, stuck it on a saucer, and put it on the table. And this young captain, arrogant bastard, I remember him, non-SAS, called to me and said, "Hey, basically the finger coming back to me and said, take that away and put it on a proper butter dish." So I was mortified, a 20-year-old bloke, SAS qualified, being told by this sort of what we called a jam skiller in those days that, you don't understand the sort of decorum in the mess, put it on a proper dish. So I went back and I was fuming, and I thought, thereafter, every time I sort of think of the SAS, that's one of the more prominent things that I remember, that despite the fact that I'd gone through a very tough selection, paratroops, and I'd been accepted into the ranks of a very fine special forces unit, I did from time to time have to have to wait hand and foot on people who really weren't members of the unit. So
yeah,
it's not what I wanted to do. It was no way. So
yeah.
a little bit of an anecdote, but 50 years later, as I said, I still think that I can still remember that quite clearly.
Yeah, and I mean it's completely understandable as well, having done all the training and a past selection, which of course is arduous now as it was back then. And in the prelude to this, we had a quick chat. I mean, I have a lot of friends and peers in both units, both in Perth and in Sydney, and certainly know from their experiences how hard it is to even get in, or and how selective it really is, and how challenging those roles are. One question I must ask though, because you did say from the start that you joined in to do your 3 years. All of a sudden, you're doing selection. That's a pretty serious pivot. What drove you to even consider attempting selection, especially when you were in there, I guess, for a short time initially, to secure some economic means?
I was very fortunate. Time was right for me, and a couple of selection courses prior to me. I think that sort of process started. The younger guys were being taken in, but I had done my recruit training course, which was 3 months over at Kaputa, 1 RTB, and I asked for infantry as my career choice. Other guys went to intelligence, some went to transport, rescue, whatever. They went to the various sort of arms, and I chose infantry, which wasn't a popular choice. And in fact, I think I was one of two who actually chose infantry. A number of others were selected to go to infantry. They didn't have much choice, but because you can only have so many drivers, cooks, whatever, But the core of the Australian Army in those days was infantry. So more guys were going to be sort of told to go to infantry than elsewhere. But I was happy to do that. We went up to battling over at Ingleburn, just outside Liverpool in New South Wales. And we did 3 months. It was tough, because it was coming into the winter. It was very cold. It was always raining, and a lot of our field work was crossing rivers in the middle of winter type thing. So it really sort of got me into the infantry mindset. This is a tough life, but it's really enjoyable. And in the process of that, we actually had a visit from I would call it a roadshow, but probably not. Maybe that's a bit too glamorous. But a few guys from the SAS were doing the rounds of various units, and they were presenting the SAS in a reasonably good light. What a great challenge it would be for younger people, younger men to go to this unit, and for those who were sort of selected to go across to do the full selection, it was a good opportunity. And I thought, well, at that stage during the infantry battle wing training, we were talking at that stage about going to the reinforcement platoon, which would have seen me, and rather than going to one of the battalions, just straight into the Rio platoon, which would have sort of seen me getting to Vietnam more quickly. But I at that stage, so I opted to go to. I thought, well, I'll put my hand up for this, and I said, yeah, I'd love to try this. 3 or 4 of us did that, and a lot of the guys I was training with said, well, why would you be so crazy to do that? That's so tough and so hard, which sort of made me puff out my chest a little bit more. I thought, well, yeah, it is. The perception is that it is tough and hard, which it turned out to be. And I put my hand up, but I passed the medical, and in those days. I think they have psych testing now, which is far more extensive than it was in those days, and I think they also call it a barrier test now, but where they actually push guys through a pre-selection selection, and then those guys are sort of shortlisted and sent across to Western Australia. Whereas in my day, it was the small numbers were picked at a time, probably from most of the training courses, recruit training, corps training, and so forth. And I ended up in Perth, in Swanbourne, probably about July or August 71, preparatory to doing the selection course. Now, I had to wait until they could build the numbers up. There was a selection course underway at the time. So that would finish. And then as the numbers sort of came across and assembled in Swanbourne, in Campbell Barrack, then my selection would get underway. I was very fortunate. I don't know why they did this at the time. But the 4 or 5 of us who came in my batch, I think there were 4, we were actually told, well, there's no accommodation essentially, so we're going to put you in with one squadron. So they actually sort of quartered us with one squadron and said, well, because you're with one squadron, you may as well sort of get the feel of the unit, and whatever they're engaged on, you'll be engaged on. And that would include things like roping, climbing, rappelling, and so forth. So I was very fortunate that even though I was a black beret and non-selection qualified at that stage, we were accommodated in one squadron quarters and allowed to to parade with them. So once the selection got underway, of course, we were then relocated. But it gave me an insight into the unit and some of the guys and how they thought. So it was a little bit of an additional motivator for me. I really wanted to get in. It became more than just testing myself. I liked the number of the blokes that I was serving with that I'd met in one squadron. I thought these guys were really great, and they were all Vietnam veterans essentially, and most of them had just come back, so they weren't much older than me. And I decided, this is really going to this will drive me. So when the selection got underway, which was the first part was over at Rottnest Island in those days, which wasn't the tourist spot that it is now. It was an old military and government facilities that had old barracks and things there. So the first 2 weeks was very much the beasting there, running everywhere and forcing guys to sort of confront their weaknesses and so. And it's surprising how many actually dropped out in that 2-week period. But it was also a learning curve for us. Not only was it sort of running everywhere, but we were given map reading exercises. We were taught how to operate as a patrol. We were given weapons training and so forth. So and a bit of Morse training. So it was really a good learning curve. And from there we went to phase 2, which was down in the forests of southwest Australia, down outside Collie, which then became more of a patrolling assessment. We'd been taught the skills, the basics on Rottnest, and then we were told to put them into practice. So we alternated as patrol commanders and different roles within the patrol, which was five-man teams in those days. So one day I would be the sort of, the medic in the patrol. The next day I might be the patrol commander, taking responsibility for an ambush or, and you're being assessed all the time by the DS who's following you around. They don't say anything to you, but so you're always on edge that you don't do anything wrong. And I was fortunate enough to get through that. The third phase being more individual down in the Stirling Ranges, which was pretty tough country. And that was really the individual phase where they just dropped you off and a fair distance from an RV checkpoint, and off you go. And all those checkpoints, of course, were on tops of hills. And if you didn't read your map, you'd be climbing long hills and false crests and so forth, and they would be on the other side of the feature. So I eventually learned that look at the map first, and if it looks like it's a long feature, go around it on the base of it and then climb straight up. So you learn your lessons as you go, and this is the good thing. But it's very fatiguing, and you're all, because you're on your own. I mean, you had to reach these certain milestones within certain times, and then get back to your RV points the day or two after. It was a challenge individually, and that was like 2 weeks. And then the last couple of weeks, which rounded out to about 8 weeks, was more of the sort of, okay, these are the skills which you'll come across in the unit. There's small craft handling, bit of diving and so forth. And then to finish it all off, there was a 20 miler in 30 Ks, 32 K. I think it was miles in those days, but 20 miles, which was the last in the last few days of the thing. And off you went first thing in the morning, dropped 20 miles outside of the barracks, and you had to be back at Swanbourne Campbell Barracks within a certain time, and which might have been 4 hours or something, whatever it is, 4.5 hours. So even though we were fit as fiddles, they were still quite, and that was in basic bush order, sort of webbing and rifle. And off you went, and we all got back. But by that stage, there was no one else was going to drop out, and anyone they didn't want had already been selected and said, look, you're really not up to it this time, but try again some other time. Yeah. So more or less, the guys who started that 20 miler were always going to go into the unit. And at the end of that, we were sort of taken in one by one and said, congratulations, you passed. Your next phase is the para course.
Yeah, right. Not many of the ones that started probably finished, I'd imagine.
No, I have it in my head that it was around about 20. I think I said some recently that was 16 or something, and I don't really know where I got that figure from because it's a long time ago. But we had over 100 start, 120. I mean, we went over on the landing craft, a couple of landing craft to get over to Rottnest on a stormy day. So, a flat bottom boat getting across to Rottnest. By the time we got feet on soil again, I certainly was, and a lot of the guys were. Seasick. We were vomiting as we were running. So I don't understand. I said to somebody recently, when I look back, we were all military guys, obviously. We were all soldiers. We were all at sort of a certain level of fitness. I found it remarkable, looking back, that so many guys would drop out in the first couple of weeks, and I think that's more a mental thing than anything else. So I think maybe they got over there, they didn't expect that it was what they thought it would be and chose to return to their units. But the fact that so many, there's always attrition rates are very high in selection courses,
Why do you think that is? That's a really interesting point. I mean, is that, and I guess that's happens even now. I mean, is that potentially because of the I guess allure that it has and the draw of the Sandy Beret? It's the idea of it is almost more appealing than doing the job itself.
It is. I mean, everybody, when you look at I don't want to denigrate infantry units or any other of the military, but to me, the peak of services had to be special forces. That's there's a certain cachet about it. There's a charisma about guys who serve in the unit. They're generally, and I hate this term, but it's probably appropriate, alpha male type guys. They're all very confident. They're fit as fiddles. Fit and strong. And I must have, because I look at the military, modern military now, and I find it a little bit funny at times, because when I did my selection and when I served in the Rhodesian SAS, you could walk past the guy in the street and you wouldn't know he was special forces, Whereas there seems to be a mentality, particularly in the US. I'm hearing from a friend of mine in Hereford, who served in Hereford, that's starting to encroach into Hereford, and I think also in Australian SAS. A lot of gym time. A lot of guys really bulk themselves up. They look hell of a strong and fit. But when I was a stick thin in Rhodesia, because I was carrying 70, 80 pounds, 100 pounds. I was working two-man reconnaissance, for example. I was in very dry terrain and thick bush, but dry terrain, limited rations. If you were bulked up, it would have been uncomfortable. You would lose it within a couple of weeks of that environment. It's just so tough. You're burning muscle, and there is no fat. You might sort of squat and go to the toilet once every 10 days after all, because you're not eating enough food to waste it. Your body's absorbing it all. So I know, and one of my partners never went to the toilet in a 7 or 8 day deployment. When he came back, he went and sat on the toilet, but we didn't do it because all of the food and nourishment we were taking was being absorbed by the body. So I think there's a big difference now. That the guys get a little bit carried away with the bulkiness of it, but
that's an interesting point. That's a very interesting point. I mean, I had we mentioned him again previously. I had Harry Moffat on the show mid last year, and he actually made the same observation, reflecting on his experiences in Afghanistan. The first time he deployed to his later deployments. The first time was the traditional SAS role, long range reconnaissance, and he described exactly what you just said. Blokes were kind of wiry, thin, who would just kind of disappear off into the night. But then as he came back and later rotations, sometimes, and I'm going to paraphrase him, but it was something along the lines of, that it felt at times that, they would be readying for an op, and blokes would be coming out of the gym with their Red Bulls, jumping on the helos, and off they went. And I guess that's that's an interesting shift and an interesting change. And he also had some opinions as to how and why that might have happened. And that was the changed mission profile, I guess, for what the traditional SAS role was.
Yeah, that's what I was told as well. But I mean, even when I was working later years in Iraq, I had an old Australian military guy as my RSM. It spent, enlisted in the Aussie Army in the 60s and served many years in military units. So he was like my RSM over in Iraq, and he said he was having endless problems, trying to get the guys that we had. Look, this is a commercial environment. But they were all running off to the gym at 7 o'clock in the morning, and he was saying, no, you've got to check your vehicles first. You've got to be prepared, ready to go. It might be commercial convoys. It may not be military, but you still have to do first brave service. No, we've got to go to the gym. We've got to go to the gym. And it was ridiculous. And then they were getting all stoked up if they couldn't get down to the PX and get their protein powder. It was really quite absurd. They became obsessed about it. And I was in Indonesia on a commercial site one day, and I was bringing in an ex-SAS consultant to come, and he was a very wiry. He was a climber, and he was a superb climber. I won't mention his name here, but he was a very well-known climber within the year, one of the better ones. And he was also a bit of an intellectual. He did a couple of language courses, the long 12-month courses over in Victoria. And anyway, I said I was on the LZ waiting for the helicopter to come in from Balikpapan. It was on Kalimantan, Borneo. And I had a couple of guys around me, and I'm 6'4" and I'm quite big, and people think, well, yeah, that's my sort of image of an SAS guy and the special force. Anyway, this guy gets off the helicopter, and I said, oh, here he is there, and they said, oh, he's not SAS. And I said, yeah, he is. No, he doesn't look it, because he also had glasses, horn rim glasses, which was sort of added to the image, I guess. But I said, this guy is one of the, served a long time in the SAS. Not everybody in the SAS is wants to sit in the gym and build up their sort of flex their, biceps, triceps, and so forth. There are guys who actually would rather, someone like him as a climber would rather be wiry and live because he's not carrying a huge weight when he's climbing up a rock face, So, the image is, it's wrong. But it's, again, I go back to the Hollywood stuff, and this is it. You go back to when I was in Sri Lanka, I had young guys sort of putting up posters of Arnold Schwarzenegger in the Terminator, and John Rambo posters and so forth, First Blood, and they were all sort of, they were all cutting the sleeves off their arms, off their t-shirts, and I said, don't be ridiculous. Put your shirt back on, not going to have this, and it was just the way you have to be, and it encroaches into the realities, and but it's not, the world's not like that, It's sort of, you're carrying a heavy pack. A big guy's a bigger target. That's the reality.
And I definitely want to get to that, because that's a piece that really interests me, and that's this kind of cultural or popular culture of warfare, and the kind of soldier, the idealized version of a soldier. But just to kind of just to get back a little bit onto your career now, because after your time, and it's completely understandable to me now, well, especially after reading the book, having seen the guys that are now in the unit, just fresh from Vietnam, lots of stories. You're fit as a fiddle, trained, ready to go, and nowhere to go. So it makes absolute sense why you look for opportunities elsewhere. And it's quite amazing that Rhodesia at the time, of course, Zimbabwe now, was taking in people, I guess, directly. But you did have to do the Rhodesian SAS selection as well, right?
I did. And a friend of mine with whom I had done this Aussie SAS selection, Ken Smith, he was the first to go, and a couple of other sergeants who had finished their time and had been to Vietnam. They also went in between him, when Ken going, and me finally going in March 74. Ken ultimately was killed on active service, but I got there in March 74. It was a very easy process to attest into the army there. I pitched up. I'd had a medical, discharge for the Australian Army. Medical discharge. I've gone through that routine. I just produced all those papers. The doctor said, "How are you feeling?" And I said, "I'm fine, no problem." He said, "You look okay," and he signed off on it.
You're good.
Yeah, he said, "What's your eye?" Someone said, "What's your eyesight like?" I said, "It's pretty good," and essentially that was all it took. I signed the documents, and they had a vehicle to pick me up and take me down to Cranbourne Barracks, which is where the Rhodesian SAS, Sea Squadron SAS was based at the time. Very easy going, no dramas. Remembering as well, though, that Rhodesia had a very small population, and a lot of people, because of the war, was probably a few years earlier because of the declaration of UDI, Declaration of Independence. A lot of people decided they weren't going to live there, or they wanted their children to grow up in a different placement, particularly when the war started. So a lot of guys were leaving, younger guys were leaving, and there wasn't a huge pool of men from which to recruit. National service was in full swing, and that got longer and longer as the years of the war went by. So Rhodesia had a problem in recruiting good, solid manpower and keeping it, because your national serviceman only serves 6 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever it was, and then goes back to school or back to his job generally. Not at school, but to have a regular army, you actually had to recruit, and there were a lot of foreigners were coming, and not all stayed. Disappointingly, many left after 6 months, 3 months, a year, whatever. But a lot of guys did like me, decided to stay. I also grew roots into the community very quickly. I met my wife as a young, I was only 23 when I met her. She was 18 at the time, 19 when she got married to me. I was 24. So I had I had roots straight away. I had family there, so my family in Adelaide became the remote family. My immediate family was, of course, my wife and ultimately my first child, who was born in 76. So I had no trouble integrating and assimilating and becoming a part. I loved it. I considered myself very much a Rhodesian at the time, and a lot of other guys didn't. Some of the Brits brought their wives down from the UK, so they settled well. There were no issues there. They had wives and some had children, so they brought families down, and they, again, that sort of cemented them into the community. A lot of the younger guys who didn't have girlfriends and they tended to sort of lose interest after a while. There was sort of the war and the social life was pretty much intermingled, so they would come and go. But those who stayed, I mean, in the end, I stayed 6 years. I endured probably the wrong word. I experienced 6 years of combat in an environment where, unlike, and I think I gave a presentation recently. I said the difference for us in Rhodesia and South Africa was that we were actually fighting for a country in which we believed. We weren't doing a 5-month deployment to Afghanistan and back again, or 12 months to Vietnam and coming home and not going away for another year or two. We were actually constantly in the field on combat missions, returning, picked up, and that very evening I could come out of a contact in the bush in Mozambique, and that very evening I could be home with my wife and children, or child at that stage. So it was something we valued. We defended the borders as best we could. We were heavily outnumbered, of course, and with sanctions it didn't make it easy. We were often short of ammunition. Fuel was always a challenge. South Africa supported for a long time, but when they decided that they wanted to squeeze us a little bit, then fuel would be held up at Byte Bridge, and ammunition trains coming up with ammunition wouldn't get through the border quickly. So, eventually, ultimately, the South Africans called the shots there. But in the 6 years that we fought, I always thought it was a noble cause. People will criticize me and have, but many actually support me because they see what's happened in Zimbabwe with the kleptocracy, the oppression of people, the 90% unemployment, whatever. It wasn't the heaven that was promised the black community when they supported the insurgents, or the liberation groups, as they call them. So for me, it was a personal thing. I believed in the cause of Rhodesia. I thought it was reasonably just. Not everything was right, but it wasn't quite as bad in the eye from a perspective point of view as apartheid, for example. Apartheid, where that whole policy was crazy, and I always thought it was crazy, and it couldn't survive. Financially, it was just impossible to maintain twin systems. So and morally, it was totally wrong.
Yeah.
But I didn't think that was. I worked with black soldiers. I mean, I trusted my life to black soldiers. So,
yeah, well, that would be an interesting piece to talk about. I think it was when we get to your Selous Scouts days. I mean, it was a mixed race teams.
Yeah.
And I definitely want to get to that because I think that's a really unique part of your, or at least a part of the book that you describe in a lot of detail. But just going back to the point of effectively fighting for another country's cause. How was that? And I asked this from a very personal perspective because as I mentioned before we started, I mean, I was born and raised in Bosnia and found myself in the Australian Army serving overseas for Australia. And I, much like you, embraced and wholeheartedly embraced what Australia represents as stands. But how was that for you? I mean, I guess the shift from, or I guess in your case, it was slightly different because you went from one special forces unit to another and started serving on the front lines immediately. So how was that? How was that kind of mental bridge for you?
No, it actually was to me, it just seemed so normal, an evolution from the Australian SAS. I prepared myself in the Australian SAS. I'd done good courses, courses that made me valuable to the unit, that would add value to the unit and meet some of their strategic and tactical needs. So I was ready. When I came across to Rhodesia, I did the selection. I'm not saying it was easy. It was very tough, but it was short because they weren't, unlike the Australian SAS and later when the Rhodesians, they embarked on their own recruit training, so it became a long course. But I was in that sort of window of opportunity where they were wanting guys from overseas with experience, and the people I did my selection with were ex-Brit Power Regs and so forth. Some young guys, of course, Rhodesian light infantry blokes who'd been trained there. So they wanted guys to come do the selection, get through the selection, then deploy to the field, paracourse, and then on operations. They didn't need to train people through sort of 3 to 6 months recruit training. They wanted guys to come test themselves on the selection. So there it was, very tough on the eastern highlands of Rhodesia, which was in Gombe and these other places. These were tough, high mountains and very, very difficult terrain. And off we went, and it was mainly an individual effort. The first day was a sort of a team thing, carrying this huge log, telegraph pole or something, which sorted the men from the boys. And the guys did drop out from that because they found it difficult to work as a team, and they were whinging and moaning. So some people do step back from that. And then the rest of it was individually, again, going from point to point and meeting milestones within certain times and getting to the final RV where we're told, okay, well done, you've all passed. Now it's time to go and do your paracourse. The paracourse was very quick. Typical paracourse, no time wasted, a bit of ground training and then get guys up in the aircraft, which was the Dakota in those days, the C-47, CC-3. A nice aircraft to jump from. Guys would sort of kit up in the morning. It was always very early morning stuff. And then they would do the jump in the morning, and probably 2 a day. I'd have to look at my record of jumps, but it just seemed a very quick process. And then I was para qualified. I had the right, because I'd served with the Australian SAS, to wear my SAS wings anyway prior to doing that. And I was the only one on the course who had that right, because there were no other Aussie SAS guys there. But there, as I said, I think there was one Brit Power guy. He had Brit Power wings. And then we were sort of presented with the Sandy Beret and integrated immediately into the unit. And bang, I was on ops quite quickly.
Yeah. So your first, and I guess as you say, deployed quite quickly. And would you then say that was your first combat experience? That was also pretty soon after getting to Rhodesia?
Well, no, preparatory to combat. Nothing happened though. I mean, you don't know that at the time when you deploy on ops that you're not gonna have a firefight that first day or first week. But you always prepare for it and you always expect it, and this is what you expect. So it took a few ops. You always expect to come across the enemy, never did, but ultimately that first year we deployed on a very large operation into Zambia, which was a major arms cache. And that was really the first cross-border operation that had been authorized by Combined Operations in Salisbury. And it was an SAS thing. And we were no more than 50 or 60 men. That was the extent of the squadron, C squadron in those days. And off we went, and I had my first firefight that day, and exciting as hell. I know that makes me sound, sort of a little bit cold-blooded, but my expectations were, you train for years as a special forces soldier. I know that in one of your questions, what does it feel like to sort of prepare for killing people? You don't actually prepare for killing people. You train to take on an enemy, which is really a sort of a more ambiguous sort of thing rather than an individual thing. You're not visualizing the impact of a bullet on an individual body. You're thinking about an attack against a large formation of men or something like that, and fighting through, and it becomes a very sort of a little bit of ambiguity about it. But no one I know in special forces ever sort of thought, and I've seen it on TV, and again I go back to the Hollywood stuff. What was it like to kill somebody? How did you prepare yourself? No, the fact is you're training to do this, and when it happens, it's just an extension of your training. There's no joy, there's no exhilaration, exuberance about it. There's no remorse as such. I've never known anyone, this is it. I've survived. He's dead, and let's carry on to the next thing. And that's how I felt at the time. It was, I didn't take any joy in that first contact, but I had no remorse about it. He would have killed me if he'd had the opportunity. I survived that and other encounters over the years, and that's how I look at it. No.
So do you remember? No, I was just going to say, do you remember the first insurgent you killed? Yeah.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. I had him running. He was running down a river line, and he looked up. I was actually in a stop line with another Australian colleague of mine, ex-Australian SAS, and we were on the sort of edge of the river, and I looked up. The attack went in on the main camp. A huge amount of fire went down, and was returned by our opponents, the insurgents. But they also bombshelled. They didn't generally sort of at that time of the morning. It was first light, so it took them by surprise, no doubt. They did return fire, but then generally they would bombshell. They would leg it, and this guy came running down the river, which was a silly thing to do. He should have gone through the bush. Running down the river line meant he was out in the open. So my colleague and I both opened fire on him, and look, he looked up as I sort of moved. He sort of looked and saw me. He was probably no more than 50 meters away, maybe even less, you know. So we engaged him. His momentum took him into the bush, out of the river and into the bush, and then the other stop sign finished him off. So look, he was dead running, a dead man running. You know, sort of we'd hit him with a number of rounds, and he would never have survived it. I guess the adrenaline flow and all the other things that go with that just kept him running. And but yeah, I can still see that. He was in a big trench coat, military Russian style trench coat, flapping around his knees and armed. You know, so yeah, he was a fair game.
Yeah, of course. And I guess the reason I asked you that question is because that's something we don't often talk about, and certainly not in the, I guess, matter-of-fact way that you do, because perhaps most, even people in uniform like myself, have never fired a shot in anger. You know, I've never been in that situation. Although I've served on warlike operations, I certainly was never in that type of a war. But there is always this idealized version of, and you know, your book reads like every boy's kind of a dream, right? Is to join the special forces and to all the things that you know, most young boys dream of. And this is why, you know, the draw for selection, even the terminology, special forces, you know, to be selected, you're part of a special group of people who are selected to do something that very few can actually do. But I think we often forget that it's real. It's very, very real. It's, you know, pulling a trigger to take a life is, you know, you describe it as an automated response, I guess, where your training kicks in. But you know, I guess my follow-on question is it because of that training and your professionalism and commitment to that? Because you know, your entire identity, your entire being is so deeply inculcated in soldiering, in being a soldier. I mean, this is not a part-time job, right? This is not a 9 to 5, right? So I guess that comes with it. And is that then what allows you to compartmentalize it and I guess deal with the act of killing as merely part of the job?
Yeah, you do. And I mean, I know to an Australian audience, we sit in our ivory towers here and we criticize, not we, people criticize military act, and particularly on the left side, they go on, you know, particularly if you're quite woke, you know, this is a terrible thing, you know, armies are horrible things to have. Why do we need to have them? Why do we have to go to war? The reality is this is politics by other means. And you deal with it. And now, one of my former partners, who was a former SAS officer, said to me one day, just in a casual conversation, he'd never been to war. I wonder what I would have been like in a contact. And I said, Bob, you would have been exactly like me and everybody else I know. You would have just done what needed to be done. You would have extended your training. Your training would have stood you in good stead. And the extension of that was you would have pulled the trigger and carried on as normal. And that's how it has to be. You cannot, you know, I have a real thing about the way PTSD has been commercialized, industrialized, and you know, and I'm not denying it exists. Of course not, it does. But I said, you know, this is the nature of the work we do. We prepare for this, particularly as special forces. You're training. You know, you're going into a training area that's called the killing house. You know, you're doing urban warfare, house clearing, room clearing in the killing house. What else do you think it's going to be? You know, it's not the wounding house or the capture house. It's the killing house. This is what you go and you do it. And this is why when I was dealing with some special forces guys in Sri Lanka, and we built a urban warfare house clearing facility. And I said, this is your killing house. And they said, oh, really? Yeah. And I said, yeah. What do you think you're going to do in it? And they said, oh, yes, boss. That's great. Yeah. So, and they embarked on their training with tremendous vigor because they knew that this was something they could possibly put into action because they were an army, special forces, on a war footing. They were at war in Sri Lanka. So they knew if they went into an urban environment or a house clearing, operational house clearing, that there was an enemy inside who would be trying to kill them. So, and they would kill them instead. So this is the reality. You just get on with it. You know, there's no hiding under bed. I mean, someone said to me years ago, every time I hear a car backfire, I duck for cover. I said, well, we're talking modern cars. Have you ever heard a car backfire? I've never heard a car backfire. You know, so what are you talking about? You duck for cover when you're walking down the street. I mean, someone told me that happened to him in Pretoria, and I said, you're talking bullshit. Don't be ridiculous. You know, okay, fine. But, you know, they fall for this ridiculous idea that, you know, that this is what people say should happen or has happened to others, therefore it should happen to you. No, it doesn't. It doesn't always happen. And I know a lot of special forces guys who served many combats and conflicts, you know, and none of them sort of tell me, oh, John, I can't sleep at night. I'm aggrieved with bad memories and so forth. I'm always sort of alert and nervy, and no, that doesn't. None of us are like that. I know nobody like that. You know.
Okay. I mean, that's certainly interesting, and I guess it also might be viewed as controversial, and I certainly welcome it. But yeah, and I certainly welcome the discussion. I guess my only retort, I guess, to that would be, you know, what do you say to the number of veterans committing suicide? I mean, we've gone well over 500 now. You know, and this is, you know, combat and non-combat veterans, where we've lost 41 in Afghanistan. We've lost, you know, more than 10 times that to suicide.
Yeah, no, I know, and it is controversial, and I try and sort of measure it with a little bit of sensitivity when I say that. I know, for example, and I think I said in a message to you recently, PTSD is a here and now thing. But to me, someone like a paramedic who has to drag, you know, an innocent driver or victim or a passenger out of a car, a dead body, a police officer who has to go to a murder investigation or domestic violence that led to murder. These truly are horrendous. And I know policemen and paramedics who've told me, you know, they really have difficulty. They do need counselling. And I'm not talking, and when I talk about PTSD, and I don't want to say I poo-poo it, I just don't emphasize it as much with special forces, because your whole training, everything you do, the reason you go into special forces is not to be strut around with a beret on. You go in. Special forces fight wars. This is the purpose of a special forces unit. An army a general army has another role. It can be, you know, it can help a government in a time of national emergency, you know, flooding and so forth. But a special forces unit lives up to that. It is special for a reason. It's geared for war, and war is killing. So anybody or most people who go into that space, and I might be contradicted here by others who listen to this, but my view is that anyone who goes into a special forces unit is well aware of what they're about, what they may confront. And the reason they go into it is because of that. And the reason they stay in it after multiple combat tours is because they enjoy the work they do. They get a sense of achievement out of it, a sense of satisfaction that they're representing their government, they're protecting their people. And there is a nobility to this. I'm not talking about guys who say, I really enjoyed that. It was a personal challenge, and, you know, I can strut around knowing that I've endured, you know, 20, 30, 40 contacts. There is a sense within a special forces unit and a special forces that you're serving your nation, and you're doing it to the best of your ability, and you're putting everything on the line. Now, I see people talk about sportsmen doing heroics, this and how brave they are, and what courage and so forth. You know, these are highly paid sportsmen trained to do these things, and they this is not the same as a soldier, you know, and particularly a special forces guy. When you go deploy on operations, it's going to be very high risk, which is why they wouldn't deploy special forces otherwise. It is high risk. and you're putting everything on the line. And there's a chance you may not come back. And I've seen guys, I've seen a lot of people shot. I've seen colleagues shot. I've seen the horrors of men wounded. I've held people as they're crying in pain. I understand what it is. And guys like me, we've actually we've got the blood on our hands of our friends, as we've tried to save their lives. When we've loaded them into helicopters to get them back to a treatment facility, we understand that the risk is there. We see it. This is not something on a movie that you watch and so you can walk away and make a cup of coffee. This is the real deal. This is what it's like. And for guys like me who've made a career of conflict, not because I like conflict, but I like the challenges that go with it. And I also believed in what I was doing. Certain things I've pursued in my life, I actually believed the cause was right.
Is that a necessary precondition to be successful? To be successful in as you have been in all those roles, is that a necessary condition to really embrace and embody, what you're representing? Because ultimately, your life depends on it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it does. That's the reality of it. I can hum and ha, I can philosophize till the cows come home, but the reality is this is a tough life, and if you can't take it, you leave. And I don't know many people have actually left there. They do their time. Some do 10 years and go off somewhere else and start up a business. Some do 20 years and take retirement. I don't know. And I'm not saying I have a broad network of friends, but I have a pretty good network of guys I've served with and within other units. And I don't know anyone who's sort of struggled with the day-to-day demands of living now because of what they did in the past. But if anything, and I belong to a number of these military societies and associations, the RSL, South African Military Veterans, the Rhodesian, the Australian SAS, and so forth. And men use these facilities because they enjoy the companionship of those guys. They like to have it's a memory of recollections. They can talk about times they served together. They can help one another through on hard times. And I'm not saying everybody is blithely above all this. People do struggle with it to a degree, but we don't all put up our hands and say, I can't deal with this myself. I need help and I need money from the government. I need the government to sort of give me a handout. And that's my grievance with the sort of commercialization of the PTSD industry now, as I call it, is that so many people who've not been in combat, but have been on the periphery of it perhaps, are coming back and saying, for example, I remember a sort of a situation some years ago where some guy was driving Australian Army. He was with the Australian Army protection element there, and his job was based up at Victory. And occasionally he had to escort people down to the green zone, which is like 20-minute run, Yeah, and Main Route Irish was a dangerous place, It was ambush alley at times. But we used to drive up and down that thing in unprotected vehicles, soft skin vehicles. And this guy was in the Bushmaster type vehicles and driving backwards and forwards a couple of times, maybe once a week or whatever. And I heard this story from, maybe a radio station in the East or something. And he was going on about how he was struggling with PTSD because of his deployment to Iraq. And I was thinking, well, why? Why would that be the case? You never came under fire. You were living in Victory Camp, which was the biggest FOB in Iraq. You could get your McDonald's, your the coffee, all of the sort of fast food options were there. McDonald's, Burger King, whatever, Wendy's, they were all there. And you were in the biggest bloody base in Iraq, which was very rarely attacked. And you were surrounded by 25,000 US troops, including huge armor contingent. So, when people start saying that, I just think that I hate that. I hate it when people sort of come and say that they're struggling with PTSD because of a very minor challenge to their existence. I just find it. To me, sometimes it's intolerable.
I mean, I guess with your background, 50 plus years of doing this work, I can certainly empathize why that would be your view. I certainly would never call into question anyone's perspectives or how they perceive war, but there's undoubtedly a percentage of people who are, I don't want to say exploiting the system, but certainly, taking the easier road out. But I also wonder if that's you mentioned something earlier when we talked about the kind of the need to embody and believe the war you're fighting. I wonder whether you consider that might be part of the reason, right? Because some of the more recent wars that certainly Australia has been in, people, and I've spoken to a number of soldiers and even senior officers who were part of those wars. In many ways, they stopped believing in the justness of those wars. And I wonder how much that then contributes to, well, what the hell am I actually doing here? I mean, I'm risking my life, for something I don't believe in, for, political influence or alliances or financial gains or whatever it is, right? So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
No, I agree. I mean, at the end of the when the last Australian troops were withdrawn, the SAS, I think it was withdrawn from Afghanistan. There were no further deployments. I made a comment to some colleagues within the unit who had served. I said, what a waste of 20 years, essentially, or 18 years, whatever it was, 15 years at the time. The huge national treasure that's gone. Look, we have defence agreements. We are, Australia always talks about we punch above our weight. No, we're a small nation with a very small military. We're very fortunate where we're located in the world geographically, and we have certain defence, sort of advantages. We are a small army. We depend on our alliances, and if those alliances, which of course is the US security umbrella, if the US deploys on a task that they consider in their national interest, Australia has no choice but to follow on. Whether we agree with it is in no consequence. From a special forces perspective, I think there's a slight difference in that the guys would welcome the opportunity to deploy on an operation where they can test themselves. They understand that this is what they train for. But I think we're repetition year after year after year, where they're going backwards and forwards and and they tire of that. Of course they will. So you've got to, and I think with the SAS here particularly, I mean, I know guys who did 10 or 12 tours, tours of duty over in Afghanistan over the course of the deployments there. That's a hell of a lot. They have families, they have lives of their own. And so eventually they're going to start saying, my goodness, what's this all about? And I would agree with that. Whereas, as I said, I fought for countries where I lived, and in which I believed, and I could be back with my family. And I always believed that by defending the borders, I was protecting my family back in Salisbury or in Johannesburg when I moved south. So there's always that sort of justification in someone like me who's defending borders. For guys who would be, I would think constant redeployments, one after the other, a few months back in Australia, must kill your relationships, and yeah, there's and of course then that's going to create other problems as well. So would there be PTSD? Maybe not so much the PTSD, but certainly frustration, anger, a sense that a lot of this is no longer justified, and they're just wasting their time and putting their lives on the line for no reason. That may come into the questioning and into the equation somewhat. Yeah.
What's your thoughts on the and this is a question I sent you as well in preparation for this on the accusations, particularly of SAS, of all the reports that went out on Four Corners, on Killing Field, and of course now the Ghost of Timor, which allege that some members, particularly of SAS, had committed what ultimately are now being described as war crimes. Of course, I just want to emphasize that the courts should do their thing, and I certainly, and I've said this many times on this podcast, I defend all of those soldiers as much as I can, in the sense that they need their day in court. But I'm trying to understand the context and how these things could actually happen. And speaking to somebody like you, I think is a prime opportunity for that.
It's a difficult situation. Look, there's always a bad apple. Selections are very selective, And now with the amount of psychological testing before the guys even get to do the physical testing, they can generally sort of winnow out the sort of those bad apples. But there is always somebody. They get into an environment where, There's a sense of impunity because they're carrying, they're carrying weapons, they're fighting wars. So you will always get somebody who goes to the extreme, and I think every conflict has that. But I think in the main, I think it's coming to home to roost now. The command fell down. I heard from guys who said, and I would agree with this too. You've got senior sergeants who've spent 20 years or 15 years in the SAS. The SAS is a unit of, officers will hate this, but this is the reality. The SAS in Australia is a unit of troopers and NCOs, right? It's the NCOs who serve continuously there. A young officer comes along, does his selection, passes selection, serves 2 years in a specific role, and then moves out again. He's posted out because of his career path. He might come back. When an SAS officer tells me he served 10 years in the SAS, I say, bullshit, not possible. You might have done 2 years as a troop commander, 2 years as a squadron commander, and there's that sort of pyramid as it goes up because there's a lot of troop commanders relative to the unit. Then there's only so many squadron commanders, and there's only 2 ICs and a CO. So no officer can do 10 years in the regiment as a general rule.
Yeah.
As a combat leader. So your unit is comprised of sergeants, and most of your patrol commanders are sergeants, some senior corporals. And these guys have got a lot of experience. A young green officer comes over, he cannot assert himself easily. He's very much at the and I know there's a code of justice, uniform code of justice. There's a sort of a rank structure and so forth. And he's a lieutenant, so therefore he's seen further up the pecking order than a sergeant. Of course he is. On paper, the reality on the ground is slightly different. A young lieutenant, even young captains, squadron commanders come over. They haven't done a great deal of time in the SS and special forces, therefore. So they're learning as they're going, and they're dependent on very experienced senior NCOs to guide them, help them, and if that system falls down in any way, or you've got a more aggressive senior NCO who's sort of more reluctant to assist the young officer coming in, then you can have problems. Mm. So I actually think a lot of the issues that derive from the focus on the SAS now is the command fell down, and that goes all the way to the top. Now I read something today that they Dutton's prevailed on Angus Campbell that they're not going to sort of prosecute these guys. They've dropped charges or something, subject to it being an independent investigation. So all of this sort of storm and anger about the regiment, all of the criticism, the finger pointing, that all of these guys, everyone is tarred with the same brush. 39 civilians were killed by 24 SAS soldiers, whatever the figures are, random. I'm putting it over here. No, I don't think that's correct, but there'll be a process that will go through that, and innocence until proven guilty. When people were told to show cause on suspicion on accusations that were unproven at the time, show cause why they shouldn't be thrown out of the unit, discharged from the unit, I think that's a presumption of guilt, and that's where I think the hierarchy in Canberra really fell down. And showed a lack of balls, actually, because they're too political. And my view has always been generals to reach the height of senior general, you have to be a political animal. And they're seat warmers, in my view. Many of them have never fired a shot in anger. They have no idea what it's like. They have no concept of being out in the bush, being frightened. When I talk about war and, it's an evolution from your training, that doesn't mean you don't get scared. The adrenaline flows. Fear is ever present. Fear is ever present. Fear of dying, fear of being wounded, fear of letting your friends down, your comrades down in your patrol. These are all part of the sort of day-to-day operation. And if someone hasn't experienced it, they don't understand what it's like day-to-day on the ground. So, a general sitting in, and I'm not going to name names here, but a general, for example, sitting in a chair of command in Canberra has no idea what's going on the ground. I think he was probably let down by his junior officers as well. A lot of that information flow didn't go upwards, and you're left with a mess, and the poor old regiment sort of left to have fingers pointed at it, and constantly under the sort of aggressive gaze of for example the ABC with Four Corners and other news outlets sort of pointing the finger and saying you're a bunch of psychopathic killers, which is not the case. the unit in itself is very, very good. The people you get, and I was talking to a young training NCO. He finished his career in the training side a couple of years ago, and I met with him socially over a coffee just for a chat, and he said the people coming in, he was running a CQB course at the time. He said the people coming into the regiment now, this was like 2 years ago, are the best he's ever seen in his time there. And he had joined the unit like the early 2000s sometime, let's say 2004, 2005. And this was like 2020. So in the 15 years he'd served there, he said, these are the best guys coming in. And the quality is so good that you've got to walk with pride about the guys you have in the unit now. This is not a bunch of thugs and genocidal killers as might be depicted. As it's easy to depict these guys and incidents that are highlighted and publicised probably don't make there's the circumstances at the moment where something is very much in the public eye and the accusations are flying thick and fast. That does disparage the regiment, and I think it's unfair to the regiment. The regiment is a fine body of men. It's an excellent unit. It has a hugely strategic value to Australia, and it should be valued as it deserves to be valued.
No, absolutely, and I wholeheartedly agree. And as we already mentioned a couple of times, I've got a lot of friends who serve in those units now, or have served in the past, and every one of those men that I know are certainly highly ethical, highly motivated. And joined those ranks for the right reasons. But he did say something that was really, really impactful to me, and that's that's I guess what I'm really trying to zero in on. One of the things that I've addressed previously, and even with military ethicists and so on, is this idea of bad apples. There's something that doesn't sit well with me with calling a few bad apples, because nobody, in my mind, is born a war criminal. Nobody, in my mind, is born with the ability to conduct things that we would ultimately deem unethical. And I'm not even talking about Australia now. I'm not even talking about our SAS. You rightly pointed out every war has it. But you also made a really strong point that resonates so strongly with me, is that war is ugly. War is hell. War does something to people that no other human endeavor can do. Maybe we can zero in on that. I mean, what, in your view, having spent years and years and years in these types of situations, what does the environment of combat do to a soldier? How does it shape a soldier?
In the main, most people engaged in combat, and I say there's bad apples, there are, but they're very few and far between. And all the time I've served in Rhodesia was on a war footing. If you wanted combat, if you wanted combat for the sake of combat, you could join a unit that was constantly, for example, the Rhodesian Light Infantry was engaged for fire force. That means it was ready to go on call out from teams in the field. Reconnaissance teams in the field would identify an enemy position, a group, and so forth, and the RLI would generally jump in and parachute in and helicopter in. So, I mean, I know guys who did 3 operational jumps in one day into different combat environments, and it might be small contact, a couple here, 10 there, but coming down, they're still coming under fire. So, if you wanted that, you could do that all the time. And within those units, there were no accusations of atrocities. The guys were very professional. We had an incident, and I put it in my book because I wanted to highlight how accidents can happen. We had ambushed a group of 23, and we killed 17 of them, and the other 6 who escaped were seriously injured. We know that, and possibly died. So we had 100% kill and casualty rate on that. But we were told to stay in. Now, we'd been there. We took 2 casualties ourselves. We lost 2 of our men. Of the 12, we lost 2 and we were down to 10. And in last light, rainy conditions, hard to see. One of the stop signs saw a small group of 3 guys coming along, and it looked like they had weapons over their shoulders. It turned out that was sort of tools, and the ambush was initiated. Now, if we were hard-hearted, we would have just shrugged our shoulders, collateral damage, and carried on. Of the 10 of us on that helicopter when we pulled out, not one of us felt any joy or satisfaction. Every one of us was sort of lost in our own thoughts. We felt guilty that this had happened. We were sad that we'd made this mistake. and there was no, okay, fine, this doesn't really matter. There was a hell of a sense of remorse across the entire 10-man team. And when we got back to our forward base, we washed up very quietly, did our thing, and then returned to Salisbury. Very little talk along the way. So this was the way we responded to the killing by accident, and it was very rare, by the way. It wasn't a common thing. Our opponents would blame us for endless sort of massacres, killing of civilians, and so forth. Which they did themselves, but they would blame the Selous Scouts and others because they were black soldiers. But we weren't like that, and I remember every unit in which I served. That was the two in Rhodesia, which was the SAS and the Selous Scouts. We took great pains to protect people. We believed that we were working and fighting a war for a cause to protect our country. Maybe the black soldiers didn't quite see it as much as in quite the same light as the white soldiers, but they were still loyal, and many of them were sort of, felt that Mugabe and his henchmen were a terrible option, so they were prepared, that Smith was a better option, so they were going to fight even though they were black. And we had the sense across both of those units that we were protecting the locals. And when I was deployed on a task to hunt down a group that had killed a child, a white child. Now, it was months after. In
the most gruesome manner as well, yeah.
In the most gruesome manner, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, at that stage, I think they were saying I was in Selous Scouts at that stage, and someone had the audacity in Mozambique to say, I was a Selous Scout call sign that did that, which was a horrible thing to say. But it was months later, so I knew that I was unlikely to find that group. But nevertheless, I found a group, and they were taken out. My black soldiers were as enraged by that killing as the white soldiers. They felt that this was, this is yet another example of the horrors of war for sure, but the level of barbarity of our opponents. Whereas we weren't barbarous. There was nothing barbarous about us at all. We actually believed in what we were doing. We believed in the cause, and we went out to protect people. I would occasionally be on reconnaissance patrols. I would occasionally be discovered in the bush, compromised by local villagers, hunters, and so forth. People foraging in the bush. And now, if I was a bad guy and took that sort of the view that, hell, I've been compromised, my life is at risk, the only way I can to preserve my life is to kill this person, then I would have done that. But I would never have done that. One person we actually kept him overnight, and then we released him that morning on the edge of the Elzeb when the helicopter, when I could hear the helicopter. I said, there you go home. He was a hunter, so he wouldn't have been missed by his family anyway, because they would go off into the bush and hunt for several days. A local member. So we weren't there to hurt people, to hurt locals. I came around the bend of a river during a firefight and was engaging enemy in the bush. And as I came around the corner of this dry riverbed, there were civilians, women in the riverbed, not knowing which way. They were caught in the middle of this. One of them had been wounded in the leg. And I stopped and I stood up during the contact, and gestured to these ladies, these women, to get down. I was saying, get down. And they understood the hand movement during the trial. And they got down on the sand. And once we sort of skirmished through and reduced that threat, eliminated the threat, then we bandaged the woman's leg and she went back to her village. So we took pains. We went out of our way as a general rule, and everyone I know, and I served with a lot of guys, was the same. We didn't want to kill civilians. We wanted to protect their lives. This was the whole thing. A little bit corny at times. We're protecting civilization. I know Smith played this card a little bit too strongly sometimes, but essentially that's what you're saying. We're here to protect civilization. Look what's happened to the north of us, Congo and so forth. So we weren't quite as corny as that, but we believed in what we were doing, and we were there to protect Rhodesian citizens, black and white. And we didn't want to, where possible, we didn't want to injure or kill these people. when we attacked the major camps in Mozambique over the years, they built camps often near civilian positions, villages and so forth. So sometimes you would find, and they did it deliberately, because they could be serviced by the women, and they could be fed and so forth. So they did it deliberately, but they put these people at risk, and they used them as barriers and hostages, really, as a sort of as a hostage type situation. And it's very difficult when you're attacking a big camp and there's a lot of fire, a lot of chaos, confusion, noise. Your adrenaline's pumping, your mouth's dry, you're fighting through positions, and someone's shooting at you. It can be you still got to have your wits about you, and we didn't kill people.
Yeah, I mean, you made the point about Selous Scouts. I mean, it's certainly a unit that's renowned in many ways, but also has received a lot of criticism about alleged crimes that they did. Okay. And that was a question I actually had for you. It strikes me again as though the fact that you're, protecting your home effectively plays a huge role, and also therefore it's in your interest, and it's in the ethics of it implore you to look after the local population, because that's ultimately your neighbor, and tomorrow you will be living together. So it's certainly against your own interest to harm them in such a way that they would see you as the enemy, and I wonder if that's also then played a part in some of the accusations, of Western troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, because as you said before, you weren't there to fight to protect your country. You were deployed. It was merely a job, rather than protecting your family.
Yeah, but again, Iraq was slightly different. The Iraqis and the Iranians have fought themselves to a standstill for 8 years, and both believe that they fought themselves to a standstill because both armies were so good. The reality was far from the truth. When the Americans came in, cut through them like a hot knife through butter, and a month later we're in Baghdad. So the from a point of view of actually sort of achieving its first strategic aims, it was done in very, very quick time. Yeah. A lot of political blunders. Paul Bremer, for example, as the sort of the overseer of the U.S. forces disbanding the Iraqi army. Anyone who had a membership of the Ba'ath was prohibited from serving. There's absurdities. Created what is now was very much the foundation of ISIS. When these guys went and became insurgents in Iraq to resist the American occupation, it became a very difficult thing. And then you had the Sunni, the Shia conflicts as well, and that goes back 1,000 years. So this was a chance for psychopathic killers to come out of the woodwork and start killing one another as cruelly as possible, until people, people like David Petraeus came along and sort of said, well, we've got to win hearts and minds, and we've got to change our strategy a little bit, and that put the American sort of occupation onto a better footing. But all of that, the whole essence of ISIS and the cruelty and the incredible cruelty of these people, the barbarity of these, this all comes from bad decisions made in the early 2000s in Iraq. It's sometimes the West doesn't understand the Middle East, and we really should. And I've said this many times. We really shouldn't be there. Let them get on and solve their own problems. But of course, geopolitics is entirely different beast, and it's not quite that simple. But my view is, we don't understand the people. We don't understand the environment. We don't understand the animosities that go back 1,000 years. Look at you and your own. I remember being on a plane flying from London for Heathrow to Geneva, and David Owen, the foreign secretary, was on it. And I was sitting up the front in business class because I was working for the Saudis, so he always stuck me in business class when I flew. And I was sitting up the front, and I saw him, and I thought, I should go over and point my finger at him and start talking about the way he sort of, the Brit government has screwed up this whole Bosnia.
Owen Baines plan, yeah.
Yeah, it was terrible. The Sarajevo and all of this. So this was in my mind at the time. This was a contemporary event, what was going on. So, but you know better than I do about that region. These people, your people, Bosnians, Croats, and Serbs, all integrated. You were part of the same community for centuries and certainly decades. And then all of a sudden, Tito's gone, the fragmentation of Yugoslavia, and these ancient hatreds and animosities come to the fore. So, a Serb who's married a Bosnian Muslim woman, all of a sudden is anti-Islam, and his wife is kicked into touch, and they're killing, they're out killing their neighbours. It's just crazy stuff. And so the Middle East is exactly the same. There are animosities that go back centuries.
That's a spot on assessment, because I mean, and this is such a huge interest of the podcast and of my own studies and research is how does this happen? I mean, how do we, you mentioned Bosnia, how does a neighbor go and exterminate a neighbor? And one of the things I'm finding as I'm, I guess, maturing and, trying to wrestle with some of these issues is, ultimately we're all people and everybody's capable of these things, and anybody who tells me otherwise is dreaming. Which is why I keep saying no one is born a war criminal. There are bumpers one hits along the way that shape you. Of course, you're predisposed. You have certain character traits, and of course, psych assessments help with that. And if the right conditions are such, then anybody is capable of any of these acts. And I think what I find fascinating is, again, talking about the idea of purpose and embracing narratives. Why can a Bosnian Serb go and kill a Bosniak Muslim? Is because he has somehow embraced an identity that is so tied and affiliated to the history of, the narrative, not even the history, not even a true history, but the narrative that is presented of the Serbian people or Serb nation, and therefore embodies that. And somehow, if he doesn't stand up and fight for it, everything he represents or thinks or feels and believes somehow, gets blown out of the water. And therefore, he finds himself questioning, who is he? If he doesn't stand up now, when is he going to stand up? And I think this is all, and this, I think this comes back to what we talked about, the importance of believing in the cause, because that is also a protective mechanism. If you don't believe in a cause, you're far more vulnerable to residual costs. But I couldn't agree. I cannot agree more about the importance of understanding the environment you're operating in. And again, it's something I discuss on the podcast quite a lot. And we use Afghanistan quite often as an example. I mean, I often say we never fought the war we thought we fought, because we didn't understand, as much as we were effective, we didn't understand the ecosystem that we were now part of. We didn't understand the internal machinations between the various tribal groups and so on. And I think that's the point you're trying to make, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I was up in Kurdistan only 2.5 years ago. I was doing some work in Suleimania, and I was dealing with the president came from that group, not the Erbil group, but the president of the day came from the Suleimania group, and I was dealing with that group, and really on some training options and so forth. But constantly I was told it was better in the old days. Saddam was a bad guy, but Saddam laid down rules. He said, if you don't interfere in my politics and what I've imposed down in Baghdad and across the country, I will leave you alone. And essentially that's what it is. And then guys would say, we could drive from Suleimania down to Erbil, and then Erbil, we would drive all the way down to Baghdad. No checkpoints along the way, because we all went into university down in Baghdad. We had a great time. There were great discotheques and bars and so forth. Life was great. And then the Americans came and overthrew Saddam, and look at the mess we have now. I see exactly the same thing across North Africa with Libya. They moved in, I remember clearly Kevin Rudd, who was Prime Minister at the time, and not quite banging the table, but going on about, we must impose a no-fly zone over Libya. This is a terrible indictment of the ruling class there. Gaddafi is a terrible people. And I was thinking, well, what would you know about North Africa, Kevin? You, if anything, you're a China specialist. You've never been to North Africa as such. So don't impose solutions on people you don't understand. And that's what happened. When everyone said, Gaddafi was a bad guy, I went to Libya. I went to Libya in the early 2000s. Life was great for most people. Yes, there was an oppressive sense about it. Yes, he played one tribe off against the other, but they were tribes who were used to this even to this day. tribe against tribe over there, big tribes. So when you come in and overthrow this thing, the cement that kept all of these sort of non-cohesive groups together is gone. And you have this horror story now of this lunatic in Benghazi, Haftar, who was a colonel in the Libyan army, in the Gaddafi army, goes off to the States for 20 years, becomes probably a CIA asset, comes back, makes himself a field marshal, and says, I'm going to attack Tripoli. And thousands of people are killed because of that.
And then has direct phone calls with Trump.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, buffoonery.
It's interesting you mentioned Libya, because I just recently interviewed Jason Pack, who wrote an amazing book, Libya and the Enduring Global Disorder, and he uses Libya. He's a Libya expert and has spent many years there and was led businesses and so on and so forth in Libya. And one of the things he talks about, and he uses Libya as the case study, is that Libya perfectly represents the confused state of the current geopolitics, where you had literally, the French and Italians, effectively working against each other in Libya. You had, of course, Turks on one side, you had and Qatar, you had UAE on the other, you had French special forces deploy on secret missions, US supporting and UN and UK supporting the government in Tripoli. But then you had, Trump jump on a call and talk to Haftar, which again creates this complete madness where nobody knows what they're ultimately really fighting for. Right. And that is really,
It's crazy. It's crazy land, But not only that, the whole evolution of the war across the Sahel, the thousands of people who've been killed, the hundreds of thousands who've been displaced, the billions of dollars that have been spent by the French and other European nations trying to bring order to chaos across, Mali, Niger, now Burkina Faso, and so forth, and even this morning I read something about Benin. So, I mean, they're Ivory Coast. So this all came about because when Libya fragmented, a bunch of Tuaregs had been in the Libyan army. They looted all of the armories that were there. All of this weaponry ended up down in the Sahel, and then you have your liberation groups and your sort of and then you had your Islamic groups come along as well and preempt everybody else and sort of knock them around and take charge. So all of that weaponry that's sort of floating around the Sahel at the moment comes from the Libyan magazines and armories that were plundered. So at least Gaddafi was a bad guy. Saddam was a bad guy. But who are we to sort of say we shouldn't, they shouldn't be able, if their people really don't like them or don't want them, then they will rise up and overthrow them. They don't need us to be, NATO to come down and sort of start. I saw Tripoli after NATO campaign. I mean, there was huge damage across the city. They were more selective than, say, the Russians are with Ukraine, because Russian warfare is entirely different. They're lunatics there. But they were selective. But you always miss targets. I was sitting in Tripoli at the Radisson Hotel. Here's a 5-star hotel. This is how surreal it was. When there was a huge explosion, I was talking to a Libyan, a pilot actually, and I said, what's that? He said, probably just another NATO thing. And apparently, the next morning, there were two consecutive bombings and several minutes apart. The next morning, it turned out that because it was Ramadan when I was there, it turned out that they'd hit a Ramadan breaking of the fast meeting, a group. They were at mosque, and I think they killed 85, 87. And then when the sort of people came to help, they hit them again. Now, they said that was a sort of a military target. It turned out, because eventually they did investigate this and realized, and they apologized. I think it was a US aircraft that did that. They apologized. They did acknowledge that it was an error. But there's nearly 100 people killed because they're flying around sort of dropping bombs on innocent people. Keep out of it.
That's I couldn't agree more. I mean, I interviewed Mark Alasko, who was the chief targetee for the Pentagon during the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and he makes, he openly says, the 50 attempts at dropping a bomb on Saddam, every one of them was unsuccessful, but every one of them killed civilians. And that's, collateral damage, and you kind of crack on. But there's another point that you're making that really strikes me as highly relevant, and that's not only should we stay out of it, but we also need to understand or explore how did we as in the global community, how do we contribute to, the people like Saddam, Gaddafi? They sustained their power also because of either support, inadvertent or otherwise, from various powers, not necessarily just Western powers, but none of them existed in a vacuum. They all existed in an ecosystem that was feeding off each other. So none of them exist on their own. There's an action reaction going on, and to merely say, Saddam was a bad man or Gaddafi was a bad man, and we need to go in and do stuff misses a big piece of the pie. I want to just double click on the fact that neither of these were good men. But yeah, that's right. Yeah, but we certainly can't forget. Yeah,
it's very selective. It's very selective in who they choose to overthrow. And we should have learned from Iraq. They should have learned with Libya that this is. Gaddafi said, if you during the bombing campaign, if I fall, basically the gates to Europe will be pushed open because people will come and cross the Mediterranean. You'll have a huge influx of people, some of whom will be Islamist terrorists, and it's proven true. This is no longer a barrier. People get as far as the Med. They come all the way from as far south as I guess Nigeria and so forth. They cross the Sahel. Many of them die in the process. Those who sort of are tougher and get to the Med, they get on their little rubber boats and off they go. So it's a crisis, and it's cost billions of dollars, cost Europe, and it's also I think it's challenged the cohesion of some of these European states. Look, the Italians, for example, very very angry about the number of refugees landing in Italy, trying to push them on to the rest of Europe. Angela Merkel saying, we'll take 1 million of them, and then sort of experiencing the sort of the electoral displeasure of that. So there's a lot of flow on issues from this. But
absolutely.
I mean, what about Saudi? I work for a Saudi. These are civilized people, but this is an archaic royal system. There's like 6,000 people in the inner royal family, and they're all sucking from the teat of Saudi oil. So and of course they can be quite oppressive, but they went into they believed that they could bomb the Houthis in simply because the Houthis are Shia of a description, are supported by Iran. So they go and said, we can bomb these people back to the Stone Age, and without understanding that these are mountain tribal warriors who would take all of the hardship and continue to fight, which is exactly what's happened. So it's cost Saudi billions of dollars, international credibility, and they're still trying to sort of bring the Houthis to heel with their campaigns. It's ridiculous. Now they've opened up their own airspace to missiles from the Houthis. The UAE is the same. You start getting drones landing in Dubai, and they're so dependent on tourism. Do you think tourists are going to go to and stay in a 5-star hotel if they think, this 5-star hotel might be targeted by bloody drones? They're not. They'll go elsewhere. People don't, when they have their once-a-year holiday, they don't want to go to a place where they
don't want headaches.
At risk. No, they don't. They want to. So they'll say, okay, we'll go further. We'll go to Thailand, or we'll go to Singapore, or whatever. Or we'll go to Australia. We won't go to Dubai. We'll just go through Dubai. So it's selective moral outrage, and I think I was in Baghdad during the sort of regrowth or rebuilding, reconstruction phase, and that's 2004, 2005 when we were doing the elections and post-election. And people were saying to me, it was much better for the honest, the normal civilian, the local person, and it was much better under Saddam. We had electricity, we had water, we had safety, we can walk down the street. Now you walk down the street and you can be dragged into a black car and sort of have an electric drill pushed through your knees for a couple of hours and then shot in the head, and this is how brutal it became.
Yeah, I mean, I was in Iraq as a civilian contractor, and on my third day working for a British consultancy, and on my third day to deal with a credible threat to life to one of my local female staff members, and this is not something that people were familiar with in the I guess I don't want to call them old days, but pre-invasion days, where murder and executions were the norm, and were occurring very, very regularly with absolute impunity. I'm conscious of the time, but if you're happy to chat for a little longer, while I have you, I mean, you're absolutely a fountain of amazing experiences. But one of the things is that you did spend a lot of time after your battled hardened part of your career. You then went into worked for a sheikh and also worked in Brunei, which was to call it the high life is or the high rolling life would probably still be an understatement, given the kind of luxury and opulence that you would have observed. How did those experiences, or those, I think it was even 9 years, I think in total, how did those years, I guess what am I trying to ask you is, how did seeing that opulence and that luxury, perverse luxury in some instances, particularly when you're talking about Brunei, what is the taste that they left in your mouth, and how did it in any way influence how you view the world or people or power, money?
Well, I mean, once I moved, I must admit, for the first couple of years that I was with Yamani, I was seduced by the lifestyle. Make no mistake, when you're getting a DC-8 that's commercially
waiting on you,
and you've got it's configured for 20 passengers. Because there's beds and showers and all the other stuff, and your section of the plane at the rear is better than anything you possibly get commercially in first class, and you're flying around. You're going through VIP gates. You don't have to go through normal immigration processes and so forth. You're driven up to the door of your plane. You're living the high life in 5-star hotel. You do get seduced by that. But for the first 2 years I was with Yamani, I was actually still engaged in negotiations with the Sri Lankans about going back to train them. And it was only because I had a continuity and a guarantee that I'd be paid every month when I was with Yamani, whereas I was uncertain about Sri Lanka, whether I didn't think that they wouldn't pay me, but I always
just
thought
delays.
That, well, I'm used to payment monthly, and I can't be sort of, we were living hand to mouth in those days, month to month. We weren't making a huge amount of money. So I eventually chose the luxury and the lifestyle of Yamani, but I always felt disgruntled there. I always felt that I wasn't doing anywhere near what I could do, and I think he didn't undervalue us because he'd been abducted from the OPEC conference in Vienna. So he understood the necessities of good security, which is why he paid for his own security. When he was back in Saudi, he had to go under the National Guard security because of the royal family. They couldn't bring his own security into Saudi because he was under the protection of the king. But when he came out of Saudi, we were there, and if we went into Saudi, we might fly in with him, but fly out with the aircraft because it never stayed there. So I never felt that I was doing anything valuable, really valuable. And then when he started traveling in the early days as well, he was traveling very much a man on his own. He had a purpose in life still. He was no longer a minister, but he still had his interests, and he was traveling the world, Pakistan, Venezuela. These are places I went to within Cairo, and it was good. I actually felt, well, he's at risk here, and I'm earning my dollars here. But when the family started joining him and he started slowing down, and the children were traveling all the time, and his wife was in the end, we became simple, really, I guess, sort of caregivers to his children, his wife, and so we weren't really. And in the end, at the end, I was sort of answering telephones, loading bags in cars to take to aircraft and flying off with them. But the never felt the threat in Boston was the threat in Pakistan, in Karachi, for example. So shopping trips galore, and in the end, and you'd get to Italy and in Sardinia, for example, in the summer, European summer, and he'd be there, an elderly man by then, and his kids are sort of early teens, mid-teens. They want to go off to discos, and you're sitting in a discotheque with this poor man. He's sort of in his 70s then, I think, and he's sort of making out he's enjoying himself, and his kids are up dancing like crazy. But he's not in any great comfort. But you're doing this job because this is what he wants you to do.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a sort of and when I had my falling out with his wife and was told to leave, I was the fury I knew in my head because I'd surrendered so much to work for him. You know, I'd sacrificed time with my family. I was away for a long period of time. I was doing a job that I knew was never going to test me, and yet I'd been just dismissively, you know, sort of gotten rid of because his wife and I had disagreements about sort of certain things. So, and I thought, where's your loyalty, you know? So, but I also understood, yeah, he was a non-confrontational man, and he was never going to sort of pull me aside and say, John, this is not working. Tamam sort of doesn't like you here anymore. You have to go, but I'll look after you. You know, I'll pay you off a couple of months and give you time to get a decent job. He didn't do that, so that added to the fury. But I was very fortunate that a friend of mine who'd worked with the Omani team earlier, had gone to Brunei, and he heard very quickly that I'd been dismissed and rang me. I was in Perth at the time. Rang me and said, "How would you like to come to Brunei?" And I said, "That'd be great." And that's how I got up there. Brunei's like sort of Cinderella land, you know. It's you know, it's not a real country. It's massively wealthy. It's run by sort of an archaic system. I'm not going to criticize it. The Bruneians are lazy people because they're well looked after. They're not challenged. Jeffrey has in a coterie of people who are well educated from overseas, you know, internationally educated. They were smart guys. But they knew what buttons to press to make sure their jobs were secure, and they were making plenty of money out of the royal family, and it wasn't challenging at all. And you know, sort of, but by then I was trying to make money. My focus then had to be, I've got to make money. I'm getting into my 40s now. Going to war and training. You've got to stop being a gunslinger sooner or later. And I still look at some of my friends now in their 60s, still trying to get gunslinger jobs, you know. And I'm saying, why? You know, why are you doing that? You know, you've moved beyond that. But I recognized in my 40s that I didn't want to be a gunslinger anymore. I was happy to sort of be a manager, build a business, and I'd be the boss, and I'd employ gunslingers. And so vicariously, I guess I would sort of enjoy that sort of the challenge through them. You know, they're the gunslingers, but you know, they're working for me. Yeah. So that's how it came about. When Brunei sort of really imploded financially because of the circumstances with Jeffrey plundering Brunei Investment Agency funds to the tune of billions and billions of dollars went missing on unapproved investments and so forth. He disappeared. He took the easy route and ran away to London and went into self-imposed exile for a while and let his business collapse around his ears. So it was dismantled gracefully by professional people. I was paid out for enough money to keep me going, and I came back to Perth, where I hadn't really lived for a long time. I had a house, but hadn't really lived here. And my wife and youngest daughter came back as well. So, and I was up at the SAS, and that's where I met my partners, who were recently retired officers from the regiment, and because I'd been around a lot, I was introduced to these guys, and we found sort of a harmony in what we wanted to do, and that's how we started the business. So my periods with the Omani and Brunei Royal Family were eye openers in the fact that you see the luxury, the ostentatious wealth that around these people, but it also shows you the horrible side of people, the hangers on, the people who do anything to make a buck, you know. The backstabbers, and you know, the ones who sort of kiss ass and just to move up in the system. And it's really quite horrible to see, and money does do that to people. So and people get ambitious, they want to make money, and all of a sudden they think they're capable of being the PA to someone like a Sheikh Yamani, and therefore they're worthy of a salary of $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 a year when really you wouldn't employ them much beyond sort of, you know, picking up your suitcases. But they made it. So I wasn't impressed with that world. And it's not real, you know, It's not real. And you see this wealth and ostentation, and I see it, you see it now. I mean, it's so bad now. If you look at, I mean, just horrible to see, you know, the world seems to be focused on influences and things, and, you know, selling crap that people don't really want, you know. Someone goes on some second-rate TV show like Married at First Sight or something, and then they go off and make a career influencing people, you know, to the tune of $10,000 for something, you know, endorsing one product. It's ridiculous. ridiculous, you know. So money to me has never been the motivating factor. I always felt you have to have a cause. You have to believe in something. And when I was with Yamani and the Brunei Royal Family, I didn't believe in the cause. All I believed in was that I was building a nest egg for my family. I was building a lifestyle so I could look after my family, and that was the only reason behind it, you know. But there was no sense of sacrificing myself to, you know, for a cause. It was 9 years wasted, really.
Yeah. Which again, it speaks to, you know, much of what we talked about, you know, about the importance of purpose. Two more questions, if I can, and again, noting the time. But one thing that really stood out to me, and I speak a couple of languages and I've kind of lived in different environments through circumstances, mainly, not because necessarily by choice. But I found it amazing and a really, really interesting insight that in the book you write that you forced yourself to take time out of your busy schedule to learn, you know, languages like Italian, Spanish, French, and I think even Thai. Why did you do that? And, you know, what was the impact of that learning, you know, to your, I guess, to your professional career, but also your personal relationships?
Well, with Yamani, with Yamani, it was a convenience thing because we were traveling in you know, for example, in Sardinia. When we got to Sardinia, he employed local staff, you know, cleaners, maids, and looking after kids and stuff. None of them could speak English, so to communicate with them, I had to learn as best I could. Now I would sit with a dictionary on duty, and I'd sort of go through it. And one of the girls would walk past and sort of say good morning, so I'd say something to her in Italian and ask if that was the correct pronunciation, and it encourages you to do more. I remember being up in the Red Sea in Hurghada, and I picked up an Arabic book and I started learning Arabic, which was Egyptian Arabic because, of course, it was Egypt. And then I went to Jordan. I was in Amman. And I started talking to a taxi driver in what I thought was good Arabic. And he started laughing at me. And I said, "What are you laughing at?" Because he could speak English. I said, "What are you laughing at?" He says, "Your accent is so bad. You're saying words, you know, we don't say that word." I said, "But this is what I learned." He said, "No, that's Egyptian Arabic. It's different." So when people sort of discourage you by laughing at you, I threw the book away. I thought, I'm never going to learn Arabic. But when I was in Thailand, in Brunei, the bulk of the workforce was Thai, and they were craftsmen, tradesmen. These were guys from the villages. Not a word of English amongst them, you know, and there were 10,000 of them at one stage across all of these different companies. And there was a lot of industrial unhappiness, you know, about wages and the way they were treated, because a lot of the managers, the line managers, were Chinese. Now the Chinese can be very arrogant. This is like Singaporean Chinese, Malaysian Chinese, and so forth, some Bruneian Chinese. And they would talk down to the Thais, and the Thais would get up in arms because, you know, the Thais are an aggressive nation. You know, there's an army. They've got a great army. You know, they've got a good history. And they might be tradesmen and craftsmen, but they know that they can, you know,
they're proud people.
So I thought, well, I've got it. So I had a security guard who spoke very good English. And so I sort of said, "Okay, you're now with me. You will help me with my pronunciation because Thai is tonal language." And I would walk around with this little dictionary, a tiny little dictionary with a couple of thousand words and phrases and so forth. And I'd say, "This is what I want to say to these guys now." And he'd say, "Yeah, I'd say it like this." And I'd put it together. And essentially, look, I didn't, there's no fluency in what I was saying, but these guys would sit and talk back to me in Thai. And where I didn't quite follow it, then my interpreter would help me. And it really built bridges across to these guys. I never had any issues with these guys. The same with my workforce. I had guard force, and these guys sort of couldn't speak English really. They when they were recruited, they were supposed to have a level of English, a basic level of English. And so, you know, just being able to communicate with people was very important. And I remember being in Sardinia one day, and we were pulled over. I was in the second vehicle. In the front vehicle, Zaki Yamani was driving himself, which we didn't like him doing because he was a terrible driver. But anyway, because he had the Saudi ambassador to Rome, it was his mate, you know, and he was down and staying with Yamani, and he was a passenger. So they're driving, and as they were driving, they were pulled over by a police car with those little sticks that they wave, you know, and they pulled it. So I sort of jumped out of the car and I sort of ran forward and I started talking to these guys. I said, "You need to leave these people alone because they're diplomats, you know." And as soon as I said diplomatically or something, these guys said, oh, okay, and off we went. So the ability to talk to people and just sort of get a message across, I found was quite important. And I remember being in just across the border from Geneva in France, and I was saying to some of the Brit guys on the team, you really, because none of the local staff could speak English. Haute Savoie area, sort of they're quite sort of proud of their Frenchness, and no, you must learn French. So I said to them, you really should learn a few words of French. No. They can learn our language. They must learn ours. I said, no, you're in France. So sometimes the attitude's not there, and so I did learn. But the Spanish side, because we were going to Tenerife a lot with Yamani at that stage, and I was also looking to try and get a job in Colombia, which was in those days with DSL, I think it was, and they had the BP contract. So I thought, well, to stand out from the crowd, I should be able to speak a bit of Spanish. So I bought one of these US diplomatic courses in Boston, which was quite a good course, and it was taped in those days, not CDs. And I just sort of would sit and walk around when I was off duty with the tape playing in my ears until eventually I sort of started to get the pronunciation properly, and it would come more easily. So I could pitch up at an airline desk in Tenerife, for example, and sort of yabber away in Spanish about what seat I wanted, and people would respond as quickly, thinking I could speak really good Spanish.
Yeah.
So you live and learn.
But there's something that's really important in what you're saying that really resonates with me is that every anecdote you've mentioned now and how your language helped you, or languages, you've humanized the other.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You've built a bridge, and you've seen the human behind the circumstances, which allows you to empathize with them, which allows you to ethically connect and morally connect to those people, to understand their circumstances, to embrace and embody their purpose, represent them, understand their purpose in life, which I think is invaluable. Is invaluable as a professional soldier like you were. I mean, and for all of our soldiers. I mean, again, the reason I brought that up is because that's certainly something that I, again, discuss quite a lot on the podcast. This idea, culture is a big word thrown around a lot, but, I support a couple of courses that deal with culture and intercultural understanding in the Australian Army now, because I really believe that to understand, even if it's an enemy, call it an enemy, to understand your enemy, you need to understand the ecosystem, how they view the world. Language is one of those lenses, and if you don't have that lens, you just cannot connect to that world at all. I mean, you're just blind to it, and that makes a distance.
No. You have to empathize with people, and you have to be able to relate to people. And if you're arrogant, leave the arrogance at the door. Leave it behind at the door when you go through the door. You've got to. Arrogance gets you nowhere. You have to deal with people. And this is what I didn't like about the sort of the wealthy world, there's a pecking order, and you are in a certain sort of position. Don't think you can move out of that pecking order, And that was the feeling I got so often from people. Yeah. Whereas I would never do that to people. The lowest, most humble person in my experience, I will talk to him as I would to a Zaki Yamani or a Prince Jeffrey, be polite, courteous, and empathetic, and that's the way it has to be, And I mean, I still have communications from people in Sri Lanka who served with me as my student, and still contact me to this day and say, the best training we ever had. You were the best guy we ever had over here. We really loved working for you and with you. We could rely on you. Yada yada yada. So you have to, you have to be able to relate to people and respect. Respect is critical. It's a truism. You treat people the way you want them to treat you, and everything's tickety-boo. There's no problems then. If you start treating people looking down on them or condescending in some way or another, no, you're just creating more battles for yourself. It's just more obstacles along the way.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. We've just ticked over 2 hours, John, but I do have to ask you probably the most important question. And that is about your family, Cass, and your 3 daughters, who, you talk about in such a nuanced way, and it's a continuous red thread throughout the book. And there's obviously a lot of love there. And also I think you represent Cass in a very strong and stoic light, but also your daughters. But undoubtedly, I mean, 50 years, and I think you've 40 odd years of marriage to Cass, through what is an extraordinarily exciting life for you, but also one that's turbulent. I mean, you've moved around the world, and in many ways, she was, I guess, making the nest at home, so to speak. Now, how did your career impact Cass, and then, of course, how did it impact your daughters over the years?
Initially, I mean, Cass actually travelled with me on operations, particularly when I was with the South African Special Forces, because that was an undercover role initially. And then when I moved across to the National Intelligence Service, which was more strategic, so Cass was with me both times, and both times was put at risk. Not so much, there was no risk when we were a member of the Rhodesian Army, because she was safe at home in Salisbury, and we were defending the borders. That was the cause. But when we moved, she actually participated, became part of my cover, and I regret having done that, but it was just the way it was. It evolved like that, and Cass was fine with it. I sacrificed a lot. She actually gave up a very good job, because Cass is a very good artist, quite well known here in West Australia, and exhibits regularly and through watercolour societies and so forth.
Oh, wow.
But she gave up a good career in Joburg to return to Bulawayo in Zimbabwe. When I was posted there under the SF, South African SF banner. And then when I got compromised, she and our two children were put at risk when I went to grab them from the house, and we ran off into the rural areas so we could get extracted, hot extracted.
Yeah.
So she was, but then came back with me to Zambia, to Lusaka, when I was at the NIS. So again, put her life and liberty more than anything else. But also the comforts of the South compared to living in the horror time in Lusaka. You couldn't get anything. It was a difficult living environment. So she sacrificed a lot. Once I've moved on to different, like the circuit, because I went after the NIS. That's when I moved into the commercial side of it with the Sri Lankan job. That was the first one on the circuit. Then Cass, and we relocated to Australia. Then she became very independent. She led her life, because I was away for so much time that she controlled the purse strings back in Perth. The money was there. She managed well. She managed the family. She raised the girls on her own, essentially. Putting all of the input was hers. So she became very independent. Not that she could have done without me. I don't want to say that or even infer that, or I don't want to even think that, but she probably could have. But she lived a very independent life. And when I would come back from places like Sri Lanka, I would sort of be very cautious about how I moved things around in the fridge, for example, because she had a system of things away.
That's my life now, and we've lived in the same house for 10 years.
Pickled onions there. When the children grew up, she developed, and she moved. She refocused on her art, and is very sort of, as I said, quite well known here in the West at the moment now, and she sort of evolved in that. So I think that's given her a certain strength. But at the same time, she did tell me, and there's no doubt about it, said how lonely her life was while I was away. She dealt with endless loneliness, and I probably could say, well, so did I. But at the same time, I knew that I was pretty active and busy, and particularly in places like Sri Lanka, not so much with Yamani, but loneliness was a part of our marriage for a long time, and the marriage struggle. Nothing's easy in a marriage. There's a lot of give and take and a compromise, and Cass compromised more than I did probably, but we are now coming up. What are we? 40, 45 years, 46 years married now.
Wow.
And known one another for nearly 50 years. So and our life is. I love her. I'm quite happy to admit that. I've always said she was the foundation of everything I did. She was the sort of anchor for me. She kept me anchored to the necessities of life, what I had to do. Without her, who knows where I would have ended up. So She's a critical part of my life. And now as we've reached retirement, semi-retirement, half-hearted retirement, the relationship is very good. We have our own lives as such. We have our own interests. She's just gone out for a meeting with lunch with some of the Zimbabwean friends who live here now. She has her art, she has a meeting, she has her exhibition, and I have my own life, which is probably not as exciting as hers, because I'm 5 years older and my head is now sort of 70, and I'm thinking, well, I've still got a couple of things I can and want to do, but I'm in no hurry to do them. So.
What are those things, John? I mean, just out of interest. I mean, I can't see you retire given everything you've done in the true sense of the word. So what are some of those things?
I still have a company. I do run a company, which is not very active at the moment, but the structure is there. Mm-hmm. And I still present proposals by invitation. People contact me and say, look, we're looking at a training program for a small special forces unit in Somalia. Could you do something? So I'll put the proposal in. And I know that 9 times out of 10 or 95 times out of 100, if it's an African inquiry, it's going to go nowhere. But it keeps me focused. I'll write up a proposal. I'll cost it, and I'll say this is what I can do, and I can find a team of 5 guys pretty easily. If you want it, here it is. And as I said, a couple of years ago, a year and a half, I was talking to the Mozambicans, but they didn't have the money. Earlier this year, I was talking to Burkina Faso, elements in Burkina Faso in the government before it was overthrown in the coup. I'm still in touch with a couple of elements in Mogadishu about a training team, but they admit they have no money, and if I could source a funder like the US Department of State or something, that'd be great. They'd give me all the support. So I still look to those things, but it's all half-hearted. I don't need it. I'm not that keen on traveling at the moment. I've been locked down here for 2 years with the COVID stuff, and it's actually given me a sort of sense that, I don't need to travel anymore. I can do a lot online, and I have people here and there. If I for example, I have a delegation coming down from an African country to Joburg end of the month, and I have somebody in Joburg who can host that meeting, so I don't really have to go if I choose not to. So it's like that. It's more hands-off stuff, and I'm writing a second book, which is more a prequel to The Fading Light, and as to what motivated me, and more coverage of the Australian SAS. So we'll see where that goes.
Wonderful. Well, I guess that change of pace has also given us The Fading Light, right? Which again, I must say, it's an amazing book, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. John, thank you so much. You've given me way more time than I would have ever hoped, but it was a fascinating discussion.
Thank you. Good talking to you. Might catch up for a beer one day, face to face.
I certainly hope so.
Okay. Thank you, mate.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Voices of War. And since you got this far, please consider showing your support by liking and reviewing the show wherever you catch your pods. Also, if you're able, please consider showing your support through our Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee page. Links to both are in the show notes. Thank you, and until next time.